Hello, my name is Ali Salman, and I welcome you to a special episode of podcast with the Prime Institute, which is a part of our series of podcast on trade policy in Pakistan. Today we have a very special guest who is visiting Islamabad from Karachi. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Aadil Nakhoda. Dr. Aadil Nakhoda is an assistant professor of economics at Institute of Business Administration, IBA, Karachi, and he specializes in international trade. He's author of several reports with the Economic Advisory Group and Prime Institute and other international journals, and is a regular contributor on trade issues in Pakistan through his newspaper columns. Dr. Aadil, thank you and welcome to Prime Institute.
So thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here.
So we'll talk mostly about the trade and international trade, which is your special area. But before we go into the trends of where we are in terms of trade, I like to since you also teach trade, international trade, how do you see the discussion around trade liberalization in Pakistan in general? Because whenever we talk at Prime Institute about opening up trade, about freeing trade, we got two kind of responses. One is that, already we have a lot of trade freedom. It's already a lot of imports are coming into Pakistan, which is not good for Pakistan's economy. So free trade is not good. And secondly, those people who understand free trade are also sort of opposing it because they think that it's not good also for the industry. So one point of critical point is that it affects the balance of payment. Another point, it erodes the local industry base, whatever we are left with. And so the general and dominating theme in the press, in the media, and even the academia is that liberalization of trade is not good for Pakistan. And I understand you have been maintaining a position which is opposite to it and which is more towards free trade. Would you like to open up generally this concept for us?
Okay, so first let's get the composition of our imports in before we actually discuss what free trade and all is about, right? So first we need to look at how much do we import, right? We import about 20% of our GDP, which is about if at the maximum it was $80 billion about in 2022, which turned out to be about maybe 25% of the GDP, right? So that amount. Now, out of that, what were we importing? It was majorly, right? So about $25 billion to $30 billion worth of fuel imports. So our main composition, if you look at it, the main demand of our imports is basically fuel imports, right? So that constitutes a lot of our imports. So if people say that we already import a lot, you have to subtract the fact that fuel imports, which is like a necessity, and because of our industrial and transportation and other demand, fuel imports are likely to be high, and that is the major contributing factor of our imports. So if we subtract that, it's about $45 billion worth of imports of other goods. And then even if you look at that, our major imports in that sense are what? A lot of that is industrial inputs, a lot of that is palm oil, etc., that we import from different places. So composition suggests that maybe we are not trading freely in that sense that we should. Now the question comes up is that what is the tariff structure? So if we look at it, compare with other countries in the region, we find that our tariffs are typically much higher than what the other countries are. So if we first look at East Asia, like if you look at the examples of Vietnam, China, even Thailand, right, Malaysia, they've all reduced their tariffs significantly over the last 20 years, and they have converged to what you would say close to zero, right? So Vietnam averages less than 1%. We, on the other hand, I was looking at the tariff structure. I was actually discussing this in another session, and it was about 10% on average, right? Our average tariff rates, which is higher than that of India. Now, even goods that we need, right? Environmental goods, something that we need for our development, capital imports, and all that, that too, we faces a lot of restrictions and tariffs. So our tariff structure, unfortunately, is designed in such a fashion that it increases the restrictions and slows down our imports. It's actually there to discourage imports, right? So if you look at the tariff structure, we are, in that sense, not trading freely. Now the question comes up is, okay, but we do allow substandard, there's a large informal channel, right, that people import through, and that works pretty well. You get, if you want to buy an iPhone, you can easily get it in Pakistan, right? You pay high duties, but you can get it, right? So there isn't any restriction on those imports as such. There are high tariffs, but you still get it through the grey channel, or you can get like devices, electronic devices through the grey channel. Everyone gets a car that they want at the end of the day. So now, but the problem there is, how do we ensure that the products that are imported, right, are being imported according to a certain standard, according to a certain quality? What is the consumer getting at the end of the day? So our trade liberalization, tariff liberalization should be designed in such a way that the ultimate beneficiary of our policies should be the consumer itself. So how do we design these strategies in a way that the consumer benefits, right? So that is why we need to look at trade policies. So the first question comes up is, when we talk about import policy, is the tariffs. How are they increasing the price of the goods? And second that we need to look at is the quality of goods. Are we being dumped by poor quality goods, which we don't even discuss? Because we have high tariffs, we think that will take care of the quality of goods that are coming in. That's not really true, because a lot of other countries, especially the blame on China is that it is dumping low quality goods into Pakistan, right? But again, that comes into our trade policy. We need to make sure that the consumers are they getting effectively priced goods at standards that are desirable for them.
So very important points you have raised. Incidentally, today I was sitting in a session in which the keynote speaker was former Finance Minister Mr. Miftah Ismail, who is in Islamabad these days. And when this question about the import controls was, and especially the revenue from the ports was put to him, he actually defended, and he said that, that's true that we recover 55 to 60% of our revenue from ports when you include not just the custom duties, but also all kind of advanced taxation. But if we don't do it, government is left with no revenue, or this is revenue question here. So he was defending it. Although he also maintains that he is a free market person, like you. So this is a sort of a practical problem which policymaker in Pakistan would face, that we can talk about free market and free trade. When it comes to import controls, everyone wants to control import. And that's a problem.
That's definitely a problem. Well, that is a problem in that way, because look, if you look at imports, right, they're easy to collect duty on. It's something that lands into your port, you put a tax on it, and you want to clear it, you need to pay a certain tax and get it out. With income tax, the other side would be to actually tax the income, right, which they are facing. So the government, the shortcut that they have to collect is through import duties. But that doesn't create efficiencies, right? That has a lot of challenges onto the economy. The fallout onto the economy is that we are becoming inefficient due to high tariffs. High tariffs, then you can know what is happening to it. We have basically low quality of goods may be coming in due to that. The goods are not being priced in properly in the local market competitively. Our export capabilities are being reduced because the imported inputs into our products are not efficiently priced, and the level of competition in the economy, which we are restricting, is reducing because of that.
So I want to pick on that point because I think the opposition to free trade also comes from the industries.
Yes.
So, Pakistan Business Council historically, but also our traditional and manufacturing classes in, let's say, Faisalabad, in Lahore, have been criticizing open trade and free trade, and saying that, look, because of the free trade, our industry has we have gone into premature deindustrialization. And while it is while you maintain that we need capital goods to maintain the export competitiveness, but on the other hand, the flow of the finished goods into Pakistan hampers the competitive advantage, because for instance, our energy costs are not that competitive, or there are other issues. How do you tackle that argument from the industry point of view?
So this is a good thing, a good point that you raised. So when it comes to the industries, an individual business, right, if you're looking at them, they are profit maximizing. They will like to do something that is basically increase their revenue, at the lowest possible cost. Right? So if I'm getting in as a business, as an individual business, I'm getting in the market, I'm being protected, right? I'm getting high tariffs, which is reducing competition, and I'm allowed to charge a higher price for a good at the least possible effort. I will like that, right? But now at the social, like the economic aspect of it, the welfare, right? The economic welfare. But that is creating distortions in that sense because you're creating high price goods for the consumers at the end of the day, right? There is no competition in the market. Consumers have lesser choice, lesser variety of products, and then they face high competition, right? Consumers don't have competition. That reduces the competition. So lack of competition kills the dynamism in the market. Now, what's the other thing, right? So when trade comes in, when you have imported varieties, you make more dynamic firms. Now, if you think about just a simple example, if you look at the US firms, right, in like the last 20 years, the top 10 US firms were very different than what it is today. But in Pakistan, you won't see that. It will be the same firms which are very successful the last 40 years, and they're still successful. The same firms are successful today, right? The business dynamism that we have is clearly lacking here. So we need to look at what is being done, and the structure of the economy itself is creating those challenges. So if you look at if we are protecting a lot of our businesses, and because of that protection, they are finding it not very viable to bring in new investments, to bring in more dynamism through innovation and competition, right? Competitive measures. Then what's going to happen is that they will be taking that as granted, the protection that they get. So now, for the sake of the economy itself, we need more dynamism. We need these businesses to bring in new innovation, new ideas. So if you look at the export side, if you are going to ask me about the export side, right? To be successful in exports, you do need more dynamism. So you see the exporters being much more efficient, much more competitive than the firms that are just selling in the local market. So we see that huge divide there. Right, so that is the example I guess you would give, right? Of
so talking about it, let's talk about exports, and we know that our exports have been stagnant for a long time, and in relative terms, the exports have gone down. Yeah. In 1990s, we were exporting about 16 or 17% of our GDP, and now it's like down to 9%, so almost half in relative sense, and in absolute sense, I was looking at the numbers from 2001 to 2007, we doubled our exports in terms of the volume, the value of the dollars. And around 2007-8, we already reached $20 billion. But then since 2007, and now we are sitting in 2024, we are still too far from doubling of exports. We have not doubled. Yeah. And we doubled in 5 or 6 years. And we could not double even in 20 years, or that trend is not visible.
Yes.
So how do you explain that?
So that's one of the biggest, I think, questions there is, why is our exports not competitive enough? Why aren't we exporting enough, right? So I think everyone has that in that mind. So one simple thing in that sense, when we talk about the anti-export bias in the economy, now think about it. When at a time in around 2016, if you noticed, our exports had plummeted at that time. We had reached 25 billion in around 2013. Then we plummeted to around 21 billion. Yes. So one of the reasons was the currency exchange rate, which a lot of people say is that we had an overvalued exchange rate. Overvalued exchange rate itself creates an anti-export bias because it makes the local economy more lucrative than exporting, right? It makes exports more expensive in that sense. So then comes a tariff policy into place. Now, if we protect our industries, we give them more support here, they are not getting the same support abroad, right? So then what happens is that they end up producing for the local market, and if your local market is lucrative, where you're getting your profits and the exchange rate is such that it's supporting your local market production and selling in the local market, right? Then you will naturally create that gap where local exporters, and if you notice, one of our largest textile businesses all have local retail outlets. Right? You do not see that in many other countries where especially the East Asian countries, you won't even know who the local outlets are. The exporters are very different than who they're selling, or the ones that are selling in the local market, right? So that's one thing. We don't create this. We need to create this environment such that exporting becomes a more lucrative activity, right? So how do we do that? Now, yes, there are other problems in that sense that you don't want to export everything that you sell, right? That because we are a large economy, there's that side of the thing. So again, we need to make our markets competitive in such a way, our domestic standards competitive, our local resources, so that the efficiency in the market in such a way that the firms export as well as sell abroad, but sell locally, right? So that both these things happen, right? So that's the idea behind it. And I think the whole thing that's driving this is the way we have structured our tariffs in many ways, right? So we have the market structure, etc. I think affects it in many ways.
Right. So you mentioned exchange rate. I think it's a central issue here, and that's like a pricing of dollars,
Yes.
right? In a put it very simplistic sense. Today I was sitting in this seminar by PIDE and Dr. Nadeem ul Haq and others were talking about and how we actually hampered our own export competitiveness by this fixation of dollars, right? And then how we actually, the former finance minister, Mr. Dar, used in last is 1 year in office about $10 billion of forex throwing the market so that the exchange rate could be maintained at the level which he thought was an optimal rate.
Yes.
And at a huge cost for the economy and exports.
Yes.
And while this argument is now becoming well known than before, I was wondering why we are not able to convince our political leaders about the fallacy
Yes.
of exchange rate, fixing the exchange rate.
Yeah, so I think there's
How can we convince?
So I think the main problem here is that this is a short-term vision, right? Short-term goal, right? I want economy stability right now. I'm spending dollars, I'm burning dollars to make sure that my economy is stable today, but I'm not caring about what's going to happen 4 years down the road because I may not be in power at that time. Right, so those issues do come up. I think there's a lot of political economy question related to this, where he may have decided that, okay, I have $10 billion extra in the reserves. Let me do things right now because let me pass on the buck to the next government, and then they will decide on what the implications and the high rising inflation, the current account deficit challenges, which we keep on entering into the cycle, right? That will become the headache of the next government. So that could be the thing that they have in mind. Let's think about it 4 years down the road, about what the challenges are. Let's do this. But that has a detrimental effect. Yes, it's made your rupee more uncompetitive in that sense that you had a sharp depreciation afterwards, right? You had a lot of speculation in the market. Speculation, I think, killed the rupee value in many ways because once you don't have reserves, right, it's easier to speculate then that the rupee will fall, and those players, they get active and they start naturally speculating a decline in the rupee. So then you have that attack on the currency. And that is something that accumulation of reserves is much needed to ensure that attack doesn't happen. So it happens with the stability of the government. Long-term vision needs to come in, and the fact that a government needs to own its policies rather than...
Are you happy that for last 1 year or so, we have maintained somewhat an stable exchange rate?
Well, again, stable exchange rate. So the thing is, if we are killing speculation in this regard, then I think it is a good thing in that sense that you don't want the rupee to naturally tank to like 350 suddenly out of the blue, right? But you need to get your economic fundamentals right. And I think that's important. We can't be in a very closed, restricted restrictions on imports, right? We can't continue with this. We need to let our economy eventually let the lid out so that we can grow eventually. So that will be a tough decision. I think in that sense, stability versus economic growth is always going to be debatable, I guess. But how the measures used, if we are burning dollars right now to keep the rupee stable, that's going to hurt us again. And that shouldn't be the case. But so what instruments are we using, right? That ultimately matters.
Yeah, I hope that is not the case. Let me take you from Pakistan to actually more on a global scale, because international trade is your area of expertise. I was sitting in a conference at Qaid-e-Azam University School of Economics today, in which Prime was also a partner. An interesting argument was presented on the stage, and that is that, okay, now already US is going to move towards protectionism with tariff on the higher side. I look at the also, in fact, on one hand, while Trump is talking about higher tariffs, on the other hand, Kamala Harris is talking about price controls. Yeah. So it's like a very sort of a dilemma where a country which is supposedly a champion of free trade is now taking those measures, and then we have this retaliatory tariffs in US-China tariff war. Do you think that is a threat to the sort of global trade order which has been emerging for last 30 years, or how do you explain that?
Of course, U.S. tariffs, that will have an effect, because U.S. being a largest economy will have effect on the other smaller economies around. But one thing that is we have to keep in mind is that U.S. tariffs are technically very specific, like they're specific to China, they're specific if they are to the EU, etc. So when you have that specificity, and then what happens is, and what we have seen is that a lot of businesses have moved from China to Vietnam and Thailand, or because they're getting better naturally trade preferences there, etc. Right, so that they're able to sell to the thing. So what you need to look at, I think, is one of those economies that have an FTA with China with the US will not be as affected, because they already have that inbuilt thing where it protects them from those higher tariffs. But then countries like Pakistan, what do? So we need to naturally look at it. Maybe the US does not impose tariffs as high tariffs on textile, right? They leave that as it is. So that could be a thing. So again, we will have to build up our own. It's I think very specific to countries, right, in that sense. But this does give us an opportunity. So if it's specific to China, and if they decide to impose higher tariffs on Chinese imports, then what about the fact that maybe we can get some of the Chinese industries, and that is what the whole idea of CPEC is, to invest here instead of investing in Vietnam, and then build up. But this again comes into how we facilitate trade, how our own structural challenges and all that affect us.
Yeah, we have zones which are empty, and it's still a long haul for us to see the productive capacity being to be built up for trade, for exports. So before, without the productive capacity, we can't have that scenario. So you mentioned the FTA in US, and this brings me back to actually free trade agreements which Pakistan has. Actually, Pakistan has very, very few free trade agreements, maybe hardly 3 or 4 or 5. Whereas other countries in Asia and developing world has much higher level of FTAs. And not just they have a great number of FTAs, but it seems that the concentration or the effectiveness of FTA is also more deeper. We have shallow FTA, but other countries have more deeper FTAs, and we heard, especially I think during the caretaker government, which last year we heard that Pakistan is moving towards more FTAs. But I've not seen much from development on that. I don't know if you have any updated views and on that, on the FTA and Pakistan in global trade.
So one thing is FTAs. Unfortunately, we haven't really pursued a lot of FTAs that we should have. Now that there's this whole talk about we should have an FTA with Vietnam, because that gives us an opportunity to build our GVCs, global value chain participation, because Vietnam being one of the largest contributors of global value chains now and the largest growth in that sector, that gives us those opportunities. But this comes to the point, as you mentioned, we have a lot of shallow FTAs. When we don't really negotiate new FTAs, the modern FTAs are very different than what was being signed about 10, 15 years ago, right? Modern FTAs talk about digitalization, they talk about capacity building, they talk about how you can invest in the skills of other countries, how you can build their skills up, right? So one thing that comes up, one chapter is the SMEs. How do you support the growth of SMEs in your trading partner? How do you look at trade facilitation methods? So then there's this whole talk about e-commerce now coming up, right? E-commerce, the digital services and all that, which we haven't, if we don't talk about new FTAs, we don't participate and we don't change that, right? So how do we bring these new ideas into our agreements? So the problem is when we don't have these agreements and we are not signing new agreements and we are not venturing into the deeper agreements, right? So there is WTO X agreements, and then there are WTO beyond WTO, right, agreements. So WTO plus agreements and all that we have. So if we don't have those commitments, so if we are just limited to the ones that were about 15 years ago, then naturally our FTAs are not going to be as worth it. So yes, and then the other point is that a lot of countries have already merged towards lower tariffs. So when they sit and negotiate, it's not about tariffs, it's about other issues, like the kind of quality goods, the SPS, the TBT measures that you have imposed, those NTMs, non-tariff measures that you have imposed, how are they affecting our trade? What is the future, like you're going to discuss? Then it's digitalization, as I talked about that, how is that going to affect our trading relationship? Right, so how do we build up better relationships in terms of cross-border paperless trade, etc.? Right, so those are the kind of conversations that you'll have with the negotiators rather than just focus on reduction of tariffs. So that is one of the reasons why we basically, when we talk about tariffs, right, the kind of FTAs that we're negotiating, then that has an impact as well. Like so we need to ensure, right, when we talk to those negotiators, what do we offer to them? Like if we are just offering them reduction in tariffs, then we don't have much to offer. But if you're offering them a lot of more, like beyond those commitments, beyond the commitments that are now tariff related, right, then we have a lot more to offer.
Yeah, it's an important point. Dr. Aadil, I know that you have been training and you have given these sessions to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on talking about trade diplomacy and increasing their awareness about international trade laws. What is your general sense of the recognition about the sensitivity of international trade diplomacy in our, let's say, the ministry or their officials, because you interact with them? What's your main sort of takeaway?
So I found that opportunity that I had when I do these training sessions with a lot of government officials, this is actually something which I find very important in that sense. So the trade missions are a very important, cog, you could say, in the wheel, right? They are the most important part, because they bring the relationships, they establish the relationships. If someone in Pakistan wants to export to a European country, they will rely on the trade missions. They will ask the trade missions to create those relationships. The trade missions will have exhibitions, they'll get the linkages, etc. Those are very important. And then the idea is to actually ensure that those linkages are maintained, right? So the facilitation those businesses they get in Pakistan should be better than what they get in other countries, right? So that is why the trade missions. And this can happen. So what I try to do with my trainings is to make sure that they have access to data. So one of the goals that I have is to make sure that the databases that there are online available, right, like Trade Map, etc. So they get those training. They look into how to, like, if you want basically to know whether you're exporting a certain product from Pakistan and which other countries are exporting that product. So someone in the trade mission who's the trade counselor should know that, right, be able to access that product data. So that is the kind of training that I give in that sense. Then there's this would talk about NTMs, what restrictions do they face? Do they have any measures that restrict imports, etc., those importing countries? So how does this affect? So that is very important in that sense. Naturally, a trade counselor should know about that. So that is why. So, but the idea again is they are a very important thing. So one thing that comes up again, we talk about our imports from Africa, right? So we are one of the largest tea importing country. So if you look at so a lot of these East African countries, such as I think Uganda, you have Kenya and all that, Pakistan stars as a top export destination because of the tea exports, right? But unfortunately, how have we built our foreign relations with those, right? Have we used tea diplomacy as a tool to measure? Because when you go to the United Nations, you go to these different forums, where a single vote, one country, one vote matters, then you can use that as a diplomacy tool, right? That, look, we are importing from you, we are importing your most important commodity. We need now, let's build your foreign relations based on that and make sure that we are able to develop on this. So trade does have an important role with diplomacy as well, as you have mentioned. If you look at, China and the US, they have a trade war going on, but it does have this effect that maybe they can't go into an all-out war because of their trade relations, right? So it does. India and China, again, they have all those problems, but if they are trading $100 billion worth of goods, they are not unlikely to go to an all-out war in that sense, right? So all of this matters. That's why building good trade relations will affect naturally your global place where you are ranked, and will again have an effect on how countries treat you when they are seeking more diplomatic relationships.
Talk about the international markets. Maybe one of the last questions I would like to ask is that where do you see in terms of trade potential going forward, Pakistan's next export destination or next international markets? Do you see more potential in new markets? You mentioned Africa, for instance. Or do you see that we need to actually do more value addition in our products in existing market? Do you see the importance of both? How would you advise commerce?
Yeah. So this is actually a very interesting question in that sense. It's again very debatable in the sense there's this whole section that says, okay, we need to invest in our quality and our products so that we can sell more to Europe and the US, which is pretty this thing in that sense that we are exporting about 10 to 6 billion to the US and maybe about 12 billion to Europe. which is very limited in that sense. If you look at the neighboring countries, they are exporting a lot more. Bangladesh is exporting much more than that, and to Europe, and they've built their whole market up in Europe. So the question comes up is how much do they demand, right? What is the demand of your product? That's the first thing you need to analyze. Do you have demand in Africa? Do you have demand in Central Asia? Do you have demand in East Asia of your products, of your textile products? Right? If you don't have that, then you're unlikely to sell no matter what you do, right? Our demand is there for the products in US and Europe. And as we can see, as I did in my own report, right, I basically said that we actually sell very low value added products. If we move up the value chain and move up the quality and make sure that our products are meeting certain requirements, quality standards, etc., maybe we can capture deeper into the market. And that could be an easier goal than try to explore new markets where you don't even know whether your products will be successful. Then the other role comes up is of the diaspora. So if you look at India, they have a strong diaspora in African countries where they're able to sell their products to. We unfortunately don't. And then there's another thing that we also need to realize. So all these African countries also want to trade with the US and Europe, right? They also have those same dreams as ambitions as we do to increase their exports. So they're also ensuring that the standards that they produce in merges with the standards that the Europeans and the US imposes on their imports. So if they are going to converge and they are going to make sure that the products that are coming into their countries meet certain standards which are similar to those of in the US and in Europe, then we are going to again face a challenge because they may say, okay, we are going to buy your low-valued, low-quality products because they are likely to be damaging our products or our standards, right? They don't fulfill the criteria that we have on our imports. So that will affect us in the long run. So again, I don't think there's a shortcut in that you can change your markets like that. You need to think about what the world wants from you. When you are going to export, you need to make sure that you are able to satisfy the demand for the products as well. And these criteria that the importing countries put right on you need to satisfy those criteria, and that could actually become stricter as we see. If you look at the European measures, the CBAM, right, carbon-based adjustment mechanism is going to become a big thing where textile producers have to meet a certain standard in their terms of emission that they have, the carbon emission that they use in their products. That will affect all our textile value chain. Then we are talking about digital sourcing, and the Europeans want to know where do you buy your cotton from, who do you buy your leather from, how is your leather sourced. All that information we'll need to be providing. So that could actually be implemented by even the African countries because they will even realize eventually that, look, we need to sell our goods to Europe and to the US and even benefit from that. So then what do we do? Because that is where the main market, where the main demand is coming from for your products, right? So I think there is no shortcut in this. You have to look at what the world wants and you have to make sure that your measures, your trade measures, NTMs and all that, and your quality standards and all are up to a certain mark. There has to be a whole overhauling of the system. And we can't just rely on subsidies and etc., right, to just boost our exports.
It's very important. So you're saying that we should increase our investment in the existing markets, but deepen the level, deepen the products themselves.
Yes.
Value addition through. Do you think the industry understands the importance of it in terms of upscaling themselves, upgrading their products, the business and the exporters?
So generally, if you talk about the big exporters, they know the challenges, right? What I think is that the firms, they have the information. The ones that are large exporters, the large-scale exporters, the successful businesses have the information to do well, right? They have that. But the fact that they may not be investing in this, they may find that protectionist policies are helping them out, but they're still being able to export in that sense. There are businesses, there are very good examples of businesses in the textile industry that have done well. But the thing is, we need the smaller businesses, the SMEs, to become more active, to become more vibrant, to become more innovative. And for that to happen, yes, they will need the information. So the government now needs to make sure that if you're going to export to Europe, you know what the requirements are before you start your production, rather than when you ship your good and then it gets seized by their customs, right? So that is something that we have heard of in agriculture, that some of their shipments have got seized at the destination and they have lost all their consignments because the SME that was exporting didn't know of the rules and regulations. So that kind of information, and then there's this whole Pakistan single window that we have set up, right? Again, done through TFA, right? The Trade Facilitation Agreement was a major thing in that. That played a role in making sure that we set up this Pakistan single window, which is, I think, a brilliant platform for us to build upon and ensure that we have better exports. So, and also increase our import efficiency, right? Both ways, trade efficiency in that sense. So this is what I think. There are examples of businesses that have done well in export. We need to build on those, but we also need to create a larger mass of exporters. A mass of exporters will only happen if we have the right structure and the right incentive, which is not coming from like high prices or price guarantees, but rather from competitive pressures. So we need to focus on pro-competitive measures rather than anti-competitive measures to ensure that.
Excellent way to finish our conversation. So exports need, to increase exports, we need more competitiveness. I think that is the main message of this podcast. I thank you, Dr. Aadil, for being with us today and sharing your insights about one of the important challenges of our economy. And hopefully our audience have enjoyed. And please leave your comments for future episodes. Thank you.